Welcome to Millennials Are Killing Capitalism. This is Jay. In this conversation, we talked with Garrett Felber about their latest book, A Continuous Struggle, The Revolutionary Life of Martin Sostre. In discussing this new political biography, we cover Sostre's ideological and political journey, history as a jailhouse lawyer, his forms of organizing practice, and the ways that people supported his campaign for freedom from political imprisonment. We talk about the influence of Great Depression-era Harlem, Black and Puerto Rican nationalism, Marxism-Leninism, national liberation movements, armed struggle, women's liberation, and anarchism on Sostre's political thought and practice. Although much of what we know about Martin Sostre has to do with political letters and writings during the time of his incarceration, Felber also shares insights that few know about Sostre's life, community organizing, and institution building on the outside. Garrett Felber is an educator, writer, and organizer. They are the author of Those Who Know Don't Say, The Nation of Islam, the Black Freedom Movement, and the Carceral State, which we had a previous conversation with Garrett about in 2020. Garrett is also the co-author, editor of The Portable Malcolm X Reader with Manning Marable. Felber is a co-founder of the abolitionist collective Study and Struggle and is currently building a radical mobile library, the Free Society People's Library in Portland, Oregon. Yesterday on our live stream, we hosted a conversation with Garrett Felber alongside Russell Schultz III, where we talked about some of the resonances between Martin Sostre's life, political thought, and approaches to political prison defense work with that of Russell Maroon Schultz. And we also discussed CurbFest, which is expanding to the West Coast for the first time this year. Tomorrow, Thursday the 29th, we will host a live stream on jailhouse lawyer Sundiata Jawanza's freedom campaign, including a quickly approaching parole date. We encourage all of you to go to the website and send letters of support for his release. Just to note, the website says that letters were due on May 19th, but there is still a little time if you can get a letter in the mail today or at least submit one electronically or contribute to the legal support fund. That would be great. There are a number of other initiatives we want to share related to this episode: the campaign to free the Mississippi Five, which Garrett Felber mentions in the episode, and the exoneration effort for Martin Sostre and his co-defendant, who is still with us, Geraldine Robinson Pointer. Links for that are in the show description as well. If you like the work that we do, please contribute to our Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee accounts. These episodes each take hours of preparation, recording time, and production time, and listeners like you are the only means of support for that work. Over the last month, we've seen a 10% decline in recurring support. We know people are under financial strain right now. But if more of you who listen are able to contribute even $1 a month, it makes this show possible and sustainable. Thank you for your support. All right, so Garrett, welcome back to Millennials Are Killing Capitalism. It's amazing. It's been 5 years since we've done a conversation with you. January of 2020 is when we put out our discussion on Those Who Know Don't Say. You were already working on this book, if I remember correctly. I think we actually talked about it or teased it a little bit towards the end of the discussion, in particular because Martin Sostre shows up in that book as well because of his work with the Nation of Islam and his work as a jailhouse lawyer, which is a big part of this story. So talk a little bit about the kind of process of discovery for you with this book. I'm sure there were many different ones, but every book, I think, for an author is kind of a journey, and this is one that you were on for quite a while. Sostre is he's a very interesting figure historically, and your book, you really show how prominent he was as a political prisoner, meaning that a lot of different people were organizing around his case, talking about his case in the 60s and 70s. And he also has a strong argument for being kind of, I would say, the most important jailhouse lawyer in the United States, the history of the U.S. There was a book that was written about his case, which is published in 1970 by Vincent Copeland. Yet he's not a very well-known figure. I think that you and William C. Anderson and Lorenzo Camboa Irvin and some others have done a lot of work in the last, 10 years, 8 to 10 years, kind of bringing that legacy back up for people and, writing articles, talking about him, obviously you with the writing of this book. But I think, he's still fairly obscure and unknown. Not a lot is known about his life, I think, by most people. And so just talk a little bit about kind of that process of discovery and recovery of this information that was writing this book for you. What were some of the moments where you found something, that made you just be like, wow, now I have to write a whole section of the book that I had no idea that this was a part of his life?
Yeah. So just to your point about how kind of obscure he was, especially like 10 years ago when I first came across him, I actually found his name in a very esoteric way. Like I was working on my dissertation research for Those Who Know Don't Say and came across his name in a letter to Malcolm X from another incarcerated Muslim who mentioned that he was in solitary confinement. And I was sort of in the process of like when I would come across names like that, I'd look them up and see if they were still alive, if I could interview them. And when I looked up Martin Sostre, there was sort of a bare bones Wikipedia page that mentioned that he had been framed in Buffalo and became a political prisoner. Like it was probably 4 or 5 sentences. And it turns out actually that Wikipedia page was being maintained by his son, Vinny. I found out later. So I saw a reference to the film Frame Up that was made about him in 1974. And I ordered a copy of that through our university library and watched that. And then I just found his name in the white pages and sent him a letter. And so that was really sort of like the backwards way that I came to know about him. I mean, if he was known at all, it was as this political prisoner who was framed in Buffalo. And I was sort of working backwards from finding out about his role in Muslim prison litigation before that. But even by 2020, as you said, when I started really thinking about what a biography would look like of him, I had an arc in mind of like, I knew the work he had done as a jailhouse lawyer with the NOI. I knew the political prisoner period. And then I had a vague sense of, because of our correspondence back and forth and what he sent me, that he had done this work in New Jersey later in life. But that was kind of the extent of the arc for me. And then there were these periods where I just was kind of found myself in like an entirely different world than I knew existed. So one of those was, I guess, starting chronologically, the military police episode during World War II, like the story that he had told, if at all. I guess I should say too, like there is so little about his early life that he had ever even recounted because he was not a person. People interviewed him often at the height of his prominence about what was happening at the time. But there was this huge gap where like you would think scholars or researchers or, someone would do like a full oral history interview. And that really never happened. So there's very few instances of him kind of reminiscing about his early life or his political influences. And the majority of those really were one interview done by Juanita Diaz-Coto in the early 90s, which was done like in a car ride from New Jersey to Manhattan. And then his son just doing kind of like family oral history interviews in the last few years of his life. So I just didn't have a lot to draw on from his early life. And the story that he told about his time in World War II was that he got dishonorably discharged for a bar fight. And so I went around trying to find any like military records. I found out that all these military records had burned in a fire, just like wild journey stuff. And then I got his 2 court-martial records because he was court-martialed twice. And then just found out that he had, been assigned to a military police unit in segregated Orlando, Florida. And it was just like trying to grapple with the politics of that and like how that might have shaped his own development. And that was just kind of a wild journey from a research standpoint, but also just from me, like trying to write that portion of the book in a way that was, like he wound up killing someone as a cop.
Yeah,
And
it was wild. I
I
reading
was just
that.
like, when I started this project, I did not think I would be writing a chapter about how Martin Sostre was a cop who killed a black man in self-defense. Like that was a wild moment to kind of unpack. And like, I hope that in that section, like I give the readers enough like structural context to kind of work through it as I was doing. And then the other section that took me like really just, I thought I was going to write this thing in 2 months and it took me a whole year, was Plattsburgh. Like I knew that he had resisted the so-called rectal examinations. I think I knew going into it that he had then been charged with assault by the state, but I had no idea that there was this whole world of like autonomous, decentralized defense committees in upstate New York that were like organizing around a big trial there where he's got, William Kunstler coming out and Dennis Cunningham and Liz Fink. And then I just started doing interviews with, as these things happen, you do an interview with one person who says, oh, you got to connect with so-and-so. And so I did like, 12 or so interviews just around the Plattsburgh committee and those arrests. So I feel like those were the two things in the book that really took a lot more effort and time than I had anticipated. And then maybe the final one would be like the Juvenile Education and Awareness Project in New Jersey. Like that was something that I kind of saw originally as an epilogue. And once I got going with Sandy and Sandy was connecting me with all the former participants of that effort, it just became like a whole world, which makes sense as 20 years of Martin's life.
Yeah. One of the interesting parts for me too was the way that you look at the development of Martin ideologically and kind of, the different periods, and I know we'll get into some of this, but, he spends time with different organizations, time within different, ways of, whether it's Marxism-Leninism or, revolutionary Black nationalism, the Nation of Islam. And, he's known, I think, by many now as this figure that introduced other folks to anarchism, but to a really, what we think of now as Black anarchism, as it always is. It was distinct from, what we might think of as European anarchism, although he was reading that stuff, right, as were other folks that he mentored and so on. Let's do a quick kind of chronology here in terms of Martin's life. In the book, you write about his life before prison. You write about his time as an MP in the military, which is what you're just referring to in terms of the bar fight, dishonorable discharge situation where he actually is discharged because he's killed somebody. His first incarceration, right, which is, I think that's an interesting part of the story too, because that's his incarceration where he's with the Nation of Islam and doing that famous case. He has a time in the bookstore organizing in Buffalo. He has the second incarceration, which is the explicitly political one, and the time after his incarceration, obviously in New York and Passaic and Paterson, New Jersey. So that's like a brief sketch even by me, but give a little bit of a more detailed, not going too deep into kind of his life.
Yeah, I mean, this is like what I find so fascinating about writing a biography, and I love biography as like a political organizing tool because you get to see on a granular level like where politicization happens, how it happens, the points where people shift their thinking, but it's never overnight. You kind of see the seeds of something years earlier, and then there's some sort of like threshold that's crossed where they like have this synthesis moment. So I think Martin's life is such a good example of this. So the first section for me was really, I felt like it was very important to lay the groundwork for like the political terrain that he grows up in, which is Great Depression, Harlem, in the 30s, where he's just surrounded by Black nationalism, Puerto Rican nationalism, communism. It's just all around in like bookstores, street corner orators, like literary societies, fraternal organizations. Like I just think, especially because those places have been eviscerated over the last 100 years, it's important for readers to understand like what that world would have looked like. And even where he's coming out saying like, oh, I wasn't really political, like that framework is all there in some way. And then, to the extent that we could get at it, there's this moment of politicization where he's in the tombs with Julio Pinto Gandia, who's this revolutionary Puerto Rican nationalist lawyer, which just seems to be like the kind of the moment for Martin where it like really all comes together. And of course, like given who Gandia was and who Martin becomes, I just think it's like impossible to ignore those similarities. He sort of like gets politicized in the tombs in 1950 during this chance meeting with Gandia, but then there's like really no organic path out when he comes out into organizing. So he winds up getting arrested in 1952 and sentenced to 6 to 12 years. Another thing that I kind of learned during this period, I mean, I had talked about in my first book about how he's, politicized, he's, learning history, learning the law, filing these lawsuits for the Nation of Islam, but also the role that his parole denial played in radicalizing him. I mean, his first lawsuit is challenging the all-white composition of the parole board. Given my own experiences organizing, I see how that plays out. So it made a lot of sense to me. So yeah, there's what winds up being a full 12-year sentence where he's part of the Nation of Islam and he's being tortured in solitary for the last, third of that for his activism and his lawsuits, and wins some, really important cases that lay the foundation for prisoners to have constitutional rights. And then gets out and goes to nearby Buffalo. He's, at Attica. And when he comes home, he goes to Buffalo and starts not one or two, but three radical bookstores in the course of like 3 years, which was another thing that I learned. Like really, I had only known about the Afro-Asian bookshop. And yeah, I mean, it's just like the way that the confluence of movement at that time happens is, the anti-Vietnam War protests are really setting off at nearby universities. The Workers' World Party has just formed around this time. And so there's just this kind of confluence of radical activity in Buffalo that his bookstore serves as like the locus for. And then there's the rebellions of 1967, and he gets framed with, an informant and sentenced to 31 to 41 years, which at that point is like a virtual life sentence, right? He's already in his 40s at that time. And then there's this 9-year period for which he's best known as a political prisoner. And that's where a lot of this political transformation that you talk about happens. So like when he is running the bookstore in Buffalo, I would say he's mostly a Black nationalist. Like he's coming out of the NOI, but he's feeling disillusioned with the organizing they're doing. He's sort of moving towards revolutionary Black nationalism. And then when he goes back inside, he starts, identifying with the RNA, the Panthers, moving towards revolutionary Black nationalism, and then Marxism-Leninism. And then really because of, I think, his break with the WWP and those folks, and because of just the availability of anarchist writings, because he then traces his anarchism back to 1967 in the streets of Buffalo, which I think is really interesting. But it's really not until the end of his prison term in the early to mid 70s where he starts identifying with anarchism and just struggling through the contradictions of like, what the hell does it mean to be a Black anarchist?
I mean, it's such an interesting thing too, because as you point out in the book, like anarchism has this huge lull, right, in the United States in particular, where it's just like you go earlier and it's like that's the thing that maybe a majority of leftists identify as. And then you have the Russian Revolution, the rise of communist parties, and so on. And, that becomes more the vehicle. And, in the 60s, a lot of it is, Marxism-Leninism with a kind of Maoist, so it's the anti-colonial movement and all of this. But yeah, I mean, it's very interesting because there's just obviously nowadays, I would say we're much more in a place where there's, a decent, I don't want to ever describe the left in the US as this big thing, but there's a good number of people who identify as one or the other, and there was definitely a period, I think, when I was a kid where most of the leftists that I met were anarchists, and maybe that's partly where I was living and all of that. But, nonetheless, these ebbs and flows. But for him in that period, he's coming into it. And you write about it in the book, too, of like some of these books just get republished and put back into circulation and become accessible to folks like him around this time.
Yeah. And it's not just him. There's other folks who are drawn to supporting him around that time that also talk about just how dominant that sort of like Marxism-Leninism Maoist tendency was. So there was a real sense of people who were like in the mid 70s being drawn towards anarchism and finding Martin at that moment and being like, oh, wow, here's a anarchist political prisoner that we can support. As well as people who were supporting him who were like, 50 years later, I'm interviewing them. They're like, oh, he was an anarchist. So, which just tells you a lot about like political defense work and stuff. It's often like people coming to the work for all sorts of reasons. But yeah, and then like what's kind of, I think, still remarkable is that he becomes, on one hand, as you mentioned, like a progenitor of contemporary Black anarchism. And yet we still don't actually have that many writings by him about anarchism explicitly. Like there's an interview, some sketches about it. But like almost the entirety of his political thought is documented during those 9 years that he's a political prisoner. Like there's very little during that early period where he's incarcerated and joining the Nation of Islam. In Buffalo, he's not writing much. He's running a bookstore. And then when he comes home in 1976, he becomes a tenant organizer and does all this, incredible work in New Jersey. So it's like you've got a 92-year life of continuous activism and 10 years of writing about how he's thinking. And so it is really hard to like, and during those 10 years, he's changing dramatically in his political thought. So there is just a little bit of an unevenness, which just is like inherent, I think, in the project of like trying to document this person's life.
Yeah, and I just think also like some of that is just I don't want to say something that's going to like piss too many people off, but like there's I'll self-critique on it as well. Like there's some of us who are more interested in there's some folks who are more interested in like what is pinpointing an ideology to some category, and then there are some people who are just like, look, I organize and these are the things that I want and believe in, but like how important is the category to a certain extent, or like how much time am I going to spend talking about the category, right? Like I figured out how I want to practice, and the practice will then, kind of also, which is something you really do get in the book too, is like how his practice, leads him to different reflections and ways of, kind of evolving his practice over time. Yeah, so we'll get to some of that, but yeah, very interesting.
Yeah, no, he was not a person who wanted to spend a lot of time parsing the categories. Like he was interested in naming the category that did some political work, whatever he's describing his politics as a shorthand to bring people to that work. That's like the extent that he wanted to spend time on that.
Yeah. It was, practical or utilitarian in terms of his, relationship to parsing those things out. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about him as a jailhouse lawyer over time. He's somebody, his status among people, anyone who knows about sort of the history of jailhouse lawyering, I've done some work and some support work with Jailhouse Lawyers Speak over the years, and like he's just a huge figure. They all know him through his legal work, if nothing else. And you write I really appreciated it. I thought this was a very poignant set of reflections by you in the book about how he understood the law, the role that these cases had for Martin in terms of organizing them and organizing, prisoner organizing and movement work, this idea of the court as, as an arena, which is something that I'm sure we'll get into a little bit more too as we go on. But yeah, if you could just give a thumbnail again of some of his jailhouse lawyering career, some of the big cases, as well as kind of how active he was with this work. But then talk a little bit about, as you point out, he's not somebody who sees the law as like some mythical thing or some, if we change the law, then everything else changes. Or maybe these are also understandings he develops over time. But he has a pretty sophisticated understanding of why he's doing it, what he's trying to do with these cases. And, he's also obviously very much not dismissive of, because, we're in a class society or a white supremacist society. Things are always going to go their way. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time struggling over the law, which might be opinion that some people would take. He does see it as having a utility, especially as he's inside.
Yeah. Yeah, I love this question. Because it does, I think, change over time. And it's a really good example of like where he's trying things out. Like he's always experimenting and then sort of refashioning like how he's approaching it. So, I mean, the big cases that he's known for really are like the cluster of cases that lay the foundation for constitutional rights for incarcerated people. So for folks who don't know, there were virtually no constitutional protections for prisoners prior to 1964. And although the case that sort of makes that possible is Cooper v. Pate in Illinois, there's a lot of precedent involved that Martin was doing. So there's really like Sostre McGinnis, which is that year of 64. But then there's these ones where he essentially, like he's writing cases that other people are filing their names. And so that was kind of a circuitous thing for me to figure out, like, even though he's not named in these cases, and sometimes he's not even like testifying, but you can trace them back to like his legal work. I mean, he's like literally writing legal templates and leaving them in bars of soap in the prison, bathroom for people to take. And then going to court and they're like, "Did you do this?" And he's like, "Yeah." And he like actually uses a legal precedent to say like this was legitimate for me to do that legally even. So I think during that first period, I mean, if you're part of an organization that's being, surveilled, repressed, all of your religious writings and materials are being taken from you, censored, you're being thrown in solitary confinement. Like for him at that point, the law was a way to create constitutional protections so those things weren't going on. And, that lives on to this day in people's rights to practice Islam inside and have access to different materials and all of that. But I think throughout that process, he becomes very aware of, that will only go so far. Like that's sort of a building block for him to make further claims on the state. And then there's, this very different approach to the law when he's being tried. Like he's not suing the state, but then in his case where he's framed and he sort of turns the courtroom into this political arena where he's like absolutely not participating. He's not calling witnesses. He's just using it as political theater. And then he goes back inside, and is thrown in solitary confinement again and, files this case that becomes really like the most important prisoners' rights case of that era and his most important case, which is Sostre v. Rockefeller, which becomes renamed Sostre v. McGinnis. And that's the one in Constance Baker Motley's court where he's like really just like opening up the full scope, which is building on his earlier cases to even be able to do that. So it's about like due process for censorship when things are censored to be able to appeal them. It's about solitary confinement. I mean, he's trying to actually sue Nelson Rockefeller for maintaining racist concentration camps. Like he's going for everything and wins. Like, I just think like it's so important to see in the scope of what in 1964, prisoners get constitutional rights for the first time. In 1970, he wins damages from the state for like they're literally telling wardens to pay him per day that he's been in solitary confinement, which, it obviously is in the context of like what's happened in the world and in social movements between 64 and 70, but it's also what's happened specifically around prisoners' rights due to Martin's cases. Like that just would have been unheard of, like they were in 64 were like, we won't even hear you talk about solitary confinement. That's not something the courts are interested in. And then they're like, every day that you're in solitary, you're going to get, $25 or whatever. And then the last major case that he wins really is Sostre v. Otis, which is about political censorship. And to your question about like how he understands the law, I mean, at least we don't have many reflections of how he understands the law during that period where he's in the nation. But by the time he's framed, like he's explicitly saying, the law is meant to be broken. Like so much of his interrogation of jurors during his case is about political conscience. And like, if he's just asking them, like, if the law contradicts your own personal conscience, what do you do? And the judge is like, you can't ask them that. And he's like, of course I can. So he, very much understands sort of the, again, like the utilitarian approach of it is like, this will carve out openings and space for revolutionary organizing inside. Like if I can get access to radical newspapers, that will carve out space to organize more effectively, but I will also in court use it to completely unearth the contradictions of the state and show how illegitimate it is. So I just think like he was using it in so many different creative ways. I mean, I even talk about that very like nitty gritty moment where he's written this incredible article about political prisoner exchanges that he can't get out of the prison because they're censoring it. And so he files a show cause order where he sends the article that he can't get out as like evidence in his show cause order, which means that now it gets out. And I just think like that is such a good example of how he's using the law. Like he's just using all the tools available to him to maneuver it within a very like narrow political space.
Yeah, awesome. There's a quote I'm going to read actually. You write, running through Sostre's testimony was his anti-authoritarianism and commitment to bringing out internal contradictions of prison authority and the courts as they failed to practice their own stated principles. Although he was over a decade away from identifying as an anarchist and saying that, quote, you have to break the law to get justice, end quote, Sostre already understood law as a form of domination of the many by the few. As political philosopher Ruth Kinna points out, point of the tyranny of law is that, quote, submitting to it involved the suspension of individual judgment, end quote. Sostre continually asserted his right to make moral and ethical judgments that compelled him to resist the laws and interests of the state. You see, Mr. Jacko, a frustrated judge explained to Sostre's attorney, quote, what seems to run through this case, if I understand this witness right, he feels he can violate prison discipline under conditions which he feels are justified, end quote. While Sostre's fight to the free exercise of religion has been read most often as a form of constitutionalism or prison reform, it carried at its core what Russian anarcho-communist Peter Kropotkin identified as the two central principles of anarchism, individual sovereignty and the moral obligation to resist authority, end quote. I thought it was a really good passage that kind of gets to what you're talking about there. That's one of the parts I really enjoyed too, reading the book, is seeing these judges who are like so frustrated by Martin, but he's so smart and he makes such sound arguments that, it's very difficult for them at times just to kind of deal with what he brings to the table as, as a thinker, as a rhetorician, but also just really making very sound legal arguments with, precedent that he's able to identify and so on. So yeah, just very fascinating.
Yeah. And he uses those moments to radicalize the people in the courtroom because they just, he like gets these judges frothing at the mouth. They're like completely apoplectic. And what they wind up doing is just kind of like banging their gavel and arresting people or, like they just sort of resort to the force of the state in a way that then like lays bare all of the sort of bureaucratic proceduralism of the court that pretends that it's just and fair. And in those moments, it's just like, oh, well, this all just falls away because actually they're just, exerting force.
Yeah, no, that's great. And that's, I know we'll get into this later, but the way that he uses trials, and the kind of organizing around trials and stuff like that is another really interesting just element of this. And as we've had other people on who have talked about this, including some immigration attorneys, but just, the importance and the power of being in the court, and having people in the court, right? And, that it's not, there's something much deeper than just the kind of, we can't hold the law up and say, oh, it's just going to go one way or another. And the judge is just going to do like, there's a space there. And if you can pack the space with a bunch of people who are on the side of Martin or whatever, right, that this has an impact. It creates, certain contradictions. And even if you don't win, it can expose so much, so yeah. And I did want to say, there's no worthier target of a lawsuit than Nelson Rockefeller, although of course they they ended up eventually getting him out of the role, meaning that the case shifts in terms of who he's suing over time because they make him shift it. So another interesting arena of the book is, as you're talking about his defense committees, which is not just, he doesn't just have like a single defense committee that raises funds for a lawyer and maybe shares a little bit of information, maybe helps out if he's, being repressed or whatever. Like they do those sorts of things. But I want to flesh this out a little because I think that maybe people have a certain idea of that kind of work, if they're involved in, some committee that supports a political prisoner. People should be involved in those committees if they're not, of course. But I found it really dynamic and interesting throughout the text how he used it, how he related to those committees, and how they kind of evolved and the kind of autonomous stuff too as it develops on. And so talk a little bit about Martin's approach to, working with outside defense committees and kind of how this evolves over time.
Yeah, I mean, he considers that moment where he shifts from a centralized committee to a decentralized group of them as sort of his first experiment in anarchist organizing. But as you say, like even when there's a centralized committee in Buffalo, it was very dynamic. So, the defense committee essentially formed in Buffalo right out of him and Geraldine being framed. And even though it was named the Martin Sostre Defense Committee, I think it's important to note that Geraldine was very much a part of both she was doing defense work for Martin when she was out on bail, but the committee itself was also doing defense work for Geraldine.
Just say quickly who Geraldine was.
Oh, yeah. We haven't covered that. So Geraldine was dating Martin at the time and running one of the bookstores, the East West bookshop. So she happened to be at the Afro-Asian bookshop the night that Martin was framed. And they even wound up sort of changing the timeline of the arrest to implicate her in the drug buy. So she wound up doing 2.5 years in prison, losing custody of her 5 children. And there's an exoneration effort still happening. Geraldine and her family live in Buffalo. And so some folks there, and I'm, loosely a part of that, are trying to finally get her exonerated for that.
Yeah, and we'll be sure to link that in the show description too, so folks can support that effort.
Awesome. I appreciate that. So, I mean, Martin always just was endlessly creative and ambitious in what he imagined these defense committees to be doing. So the ones in Buffalo were not only supporting him and Geraldine in terms of raising funds, getting legal support, protesting, showing up in court. They were also essentially running his bookstore. So the Afro-Asian bookstore in exile exists for several years at the student union. So they're like using, the framework of his bookstore to still exist, raise awareness about his case, raise funds, do political education. And even those kind of start to take on this kind of decentralized autonomous form. Like there's Martin Sostre bookstore in exiles, or Afro-Asian bookstore in exiles that pop up in other places like Milwaukee and Boston and New York. And then in 1972 or so, this is a few years after he's broken with the WWP, he really starts to emphasize creating this network, or what he's calling a federation of committees. And they take hold, especially I talk about in the book, in kind of North Country, New York, because that's where he's incarcerated at Clinton Prison. And there he gets really ambitious and starts talking about, these autonomous committees as becoming revolutionary bases that are going to deepen their work and, act for future-oriented struggle in all these ways. He's looking at buying land in North Country to build a political commune. He's talking about establishing cooperative groceries and bookstores and dry cleaners. And so it really, gets to the point where he's got almost a dozen defense committees, and they're all sort of loosely in touch with each other. And, so I talk in the book about how some of them wind up doing, expanding to looking at local conditions at the jail or women's incarceration. And then some of them move into eco defense. And so, yeah, I think to me, that was one of the surprises of writing the book, was how he decentralized his committees and how effective it was. And I just think it's, it ultimately led to him coming home, that decision to decentralize. So I think that's not only is Martin's story understudied, but I mean, he had like arguably one of the most successful anarchist political defenses of the 20th century. And I think that's noteworthy as well.
Yeah, very interesting. And yeah, I mean, really enjoyed those chapters, in terms of the level of detail and story that you share, around those experiences. We kind of moving around a little bit here, but one of the key episodes in his life, obviously, is the rebellion in Buffalo, the role of the bookstore, which we've mentioned in the three bookstores, but the one that he's at the time, as well as his role during the uprising. So this moment connects a lot of important or a couple important themes here for Sostre, which are the role of, physical spaces and sometimes also things like magazines or newspapers later on, these spaces or containers, I guess we could say, to give a little bit of a abstract term of it for it, of kind of radical movement infrastructure. So that's one thing, right? Is like these having spaces that bring people together, allow them to work together, study together, organize, whatever. And then the other is the role of radical action or practice for Martin, which is also very important. He's not somebody who's just interested in theorizing for, theory's sake. He believes you have to actually do things in order to change things. So talk a little bit about the importance of this period of his life, as well as some of the broader themes you see for Martin in this period.
Yeah, I mean, I think I had a sort of like an aha moment when I was talking to Sandy Shivak about the work that they did in Passaic and Patterson, and he, mentioned like, oh, Martin always he had planned to buy the building at 1412 Jefferson. And then I sort of had this moment where I realized that even like the front of 40 Market Street, which is the first building that they bought in New Jersey and turned into a community center, and they had books in the window, like even the facade of it looked similar. And so I think you can kind of read backwards onto the Buffalo period and the Afro-Asian bookstore and see these as prefigurative counterstructures, that Martin's really interested in building like physical, tangible structures where people can become radicalized. You can do movement work, but they have to see something tangible that is not abstract. And I think the other thing that's a key theme in his life that shows up in the Buffalo period is his use of repression as an opportunity for creative forms of dissent. So like the community bulletin board, right? There's this moment where after the rebellion, there's a fire at the tavern next door, and the fire department uses it as a pretext to blow out all of his windows, which was a common tactic during that period of like anti bookstore terrorism by the state. So he, boards up the windows and then uses it as a community bulletin board. And there's this like back and forth where the cops go by at night and like rip down all the materials and he puts them back up. And I just think like that's he does this in a number of different ways, like through jailhouse lawyering or whatever it is. But anytime the state is escalating, he's always escalating with counter tactics. And I think it's such a good lesson in like how when there's repression, it's an opportunity to move it to the next level. There's always a seed of like a new creative tactic in there. And then obviously there's like the action of what's happening in the streets of Buffalo, which he alludes to participating in and later sort of credits as like his first moment of exposure to the power of anarchism is like being in the streets of Buffalo. And so I think there's a lot of kind of looking back at that period in Buffalo where you can see his emphasis on controlling land and space and building counterstructures and political education of young people, like was a through line throughout his entire life. Yeah, all of those things.
Yeah, awesome. As you mentioned, and this was also something I didn't put together until reading this book, was I didn't realize that Workers' World Party had started in Buffalo. And Sam Marcy, right, who is another person that people may or may not know, but he's a very important figure in terms of the practice and theory or ideology of Workers' World Party, but also PSL, which becomes a split from Workers' World Party. And so he's one of the more important U.S. Marxist-Leninist thinkers coming out of actually a Trotsky organization, Socialist Workers Party, I believe.
Yeah, it's
Um,
WP.
yeah. And so he was a Buffalo resident, and they're really in the process of kind of splitting off, I guess, and forming their own organization in this time. Obviously, there's also a really both you and Orasami Burton were able to draw a lot of, really good information from Workers' World, which of course is their newspaper, because they were very involved in both documenting like Attica, but also I think also some stuff on Auburn and like the other phases of, what Ori calls the Long Attica Revolt. But also obviously they're very involved in Martin's case, and members of he's close with these folks. They're organizing in the same places and stuff, and I imagine are using the bookstore for some of their stuff and things like that. And I thought it was cool, just a slight thing, but Teddy Kelly, you wrote an acknowledgement to, who I know from her time in Philadelphia. And, there's even here when I moved to Philly, I hadn't experienced this other places that I lived, but Workers' World Party still has a significant role in the Mumia campaigns, but also had a significant role with the Move 9 in terms of getting them out. They're all, those of them that are still alive are all out now. But when I moved here, they still, I think 5 or 6 of them were still incarcerated at that time. And obviously is alongside a lot of other folks, Pam Africa, probably most notably to a lot of folks. So I just found this interesting. I found it an interesting history that, kind of at the point that their party is really starting off and getting into this stuff, that Martin is really central also to their early work here. So talk a little bit about just kind of the history of Sostre's relationship with Workers' World Party, including he eventually breaks with them, and that's an important part of his story. So I'm interested in the origins of it, but also kind of the why around the break and some of the different arguments too around that period.
Yeah, like you, I also was fascinated by the WWP's connection, and Ori and I talked a lot about because we were writing our books at the same time, where we were like, "Wait, is there a book about the WWP's organizing inside?" And we were like, both kind of wishing that existed because they're showing up everywhere. And I don't know this, but I would actually say that I wonder how much of the WWP's involvement in like the Auburn Attica support, like the groundwork for that, might have been laid through Martin's case, like that they were already really familiar with organizing inside in New York through that, because I don't know that they were actually doing any of that before Martin.
Right. Well, and it's all kind of in the same, I mean, it is in the same time period, and they're really just kind of getting into it at that time. So, yeah, I mean, yeah, anyway,
Yeah.
interesting. Yeah.
What was interesting about the WWP, right, is they're coming out of the SWP, they're in Buffalo. Bob McCubbin, who was a key part of the original defense committee, was a student at University of Buffalo and really emphasized like the Buffalo branch was working class. It was like they were doing union organizing and racial justice work. And it really just was kind of like, a lot of the left in like a city like Buffalo, right? Like there's just not that many people doing the work. And so you kind of had the people who stayed in Buffalo when Sam Marcy and folks went to New York City that were still doing the WWP, and they had shifted their focus really towards the student energy that was happening around the Vietnam War. And those students who were part of YAF, Youth Against War and Fascism, were like Jerry Ross, Bob McCubbin. And so they were kind of the younger members with, the Merrills, Jeanette and Ed, and these folks who then became the basis of the Martin Sostre Defense Committee. So these were people who had like met Martin through the bookstore and then just, formed around his defense and did incredible work. I mean, I also huge shout out to Ellie and the folks in Buffalo who are still there, because I thought I was almost done with the book, and they found 2 boxes of the original defense committee files,
Oh, wow.
which include like all Martin's. So the pamphlet the first pamphlet that the Martin Sostre Defense Committee ever made is called Letters from Prison. And for like 50 years, that and Sostre in Court, which Bob McCubbin helped make out of transcriptions from the trial, those 2 pamphlets were like most of what survived of Martin's legacy for half a century. And, and then Ellie's like, oh yeah, we went through our storage unit, and she sends me, and it's like all Martin's original letters that were the basis of letters from prison. So those are being archived at Centro, at Hunter College now. But yeah, just the WWP had a huge place in this story. And we're just doing a ton of local organizing in Buffalo on behalf of Martin and Geraldine. They were super involved in supporting Geraldine and her kids as well. And the break that happens, is around this. It's kind of hard to tell like how much is really just about this one thing. But basically in early 1970, Martin he's been wanting to start for a while a revolutionary newspaper. He had planned to start one in Buffalo before he got framed. He bought a printing press and everything. And so he starts Black News, and the WWP folks are helping him with the logistics, like the printing of it, dissemination, things like that. And Martin is the editor and writer. And his idea is that this is going to be a revolutionary weekly newspaper that's, got a whole team of people doing cartoons. And it's like really that era of like the Black Panther and all of this. And so it starts in January of 1970. And in April, he writes this piece about the political prisoner exchange again. And I'm still a little bit confused because he's already written 2 pieces about the political prisoner exchange. So it's not like a new position. But basically, Jeanette and Ed Merrill sort of like take it to who seems to be Sam Marcy in New York, and they're all just uncomfortable with running it as it is, and they want to suggest edits, and Martin's like, absolutely not. And he writes.
Do you have any insight as to what the edits were or not?
No, because I only have, what's hard about writing this is I only have his side of the story. I have his letter to them that's like recounting what they said to him, and I don't have their side of it. But I do try in the book to give some context in terms of like the repression that they're experiencing, like the death threats that they're getting to their daughter. And Martin's position is like, the state doesn't need a reason to frame you. Like, they're going to do what they're going to do. You publishing this isn't putting you at any more risk. But he's really, at the end of the day, in the letter, is just like, it makes sense that you all would go this way, as white revolutionaries. And it makes sense that I'm going this way. But it's just a firm break. Like, he's like, turn over all the defense committee work. Black News. He, at the time, imagined Black News would be published in New York City. And, he's been, because of the Rockefeller trial, he was in New York City for a while and was connecting with like the Young Lords and groups there. So I think he really imagined like a more radical, maybe more radical is not the right word, more aligned with his politics, folks in New York City.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting in the context of what he's advocating, because he's advocating basically for, as I understand, I haven't actually read the piece, but advocating an escalation of political prisoner solidarity work to include prisoner exchanges and things like this. And it has obviously, I mean, I believe you probably know this, but if my memory serves, Orasami Burton also references this piece within his book to sort of talk about how, because there is this, at Attica, there is a demand around, moving prisoners. I can't think of the right term, but basically assisting prisoners in getting exile and like possibly exchanging them, foreign countries getting involved in prisoner swaps to get prisoners out of Attica, which is something that Azori documents, like folks like Sophia Bukhari and others were actually like trying to figure out how they could possibly do this. And, Martin is somebody that is writing about this and thinking about this. And obviously he's in solitary a lot of this time, but he is somebody who has some prominence and who also has, other people know him. There's always ways that people with inside also communicate with each other, even when they're isolated from each other and so on. And yeah, I just thought it's a very interesting thing. And I also understand, on another level, it's a political line that is, yeah, I guess I would call it more radical. I mean, it's more in line with like the with anti-colonial what anti-colonial revolutions are doing around the world at the time, whether it's the Tupamaros or you know, different. I mean, we see we're living in the context of a prisoner exchange going on in Gaza right now, right, with regard to whether people want to think about it that way or not. But that's really what the context is. And so this is something that has a he's not pulling it out of nowhere, right?
No, he's
But it,
literally responding to anti-colonial, like he sees it in the news, and
yeah,
his whole point is that the provincialism of the US left is wants to cheer on anti-colonial armed struggle and doesn't want to apply it to the conditions that they're living under. And so he's like, look, there are people right now doing political prisoner exchanges in, the Dominican Republic. Why are we not applying this to our own political prisoners?
yeah, yeah, and at the same time, like I also recognize that a lot of the U.S. left, certainly now, that's not even a conversation usually. It's not a conversation I've been a part of. Um, and it's interesting in terms of, I guess, there's a level of risk aversion seemingly there from Workers' World Party around, yeah, we're not going to take that political line. And what I guess I would say is that this break seems very
Predictable.
predictable, or just something that you could see happening in any organization on the left in the United States of, you know, um, it would be a bold move for an organization to openly advocate such things. And yet at the same time, like the Panthers are doing this sort of thing, at least on a small, they're breaking prisoners out through clandestine groups and things like that in this period of time, or prisoners are escaping and running away.
I mean, this is in the context of the rise of the BLA. Like,
Yeah,
it's very. I think it also brings up though, like the a kind of inherent tension between prisoner support work, especially by organizations outside that have a line. Like, this is a party line organization that's doing support work for you know, essentially a black anarchist. Like, he hasn't identified that way yet, but he's not identifying with an organization. He's not like, I'm part of the WWP. He's like, I'm Martin. I'm publishing Black News. I'm the editor of it. I make the editorial decisions about it, And then it gets into this question of like, well, what happens when the things that we're publishing, that we're helping Martin publish, are contradictory to our line?
right.
And
Yeah,
then,
and then of course he says like, I don't let the state censor me, so why would I let you, basically,
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think it's a fascinating story and just very interesting, and I appreciated the discussion of all of it within the book. So another really interesting and important thread in his history is the relationship he has to the Puerto Rican independence movement. You already mentioned Julio Pinto Gandia. Also, Lolita LeBron shows up. And, as you mentioned, also, there's a period where he has more of a relationship with the Republic of New Africa, too, as he's looking at Black revolutionary nationalism. And then, of course, as folks probably most know, the Nation of Islam period. So, nationalism of any kind and left-wing ideology, there's always some tensions there, whether it be even within Marxist or Marxist-Leninists discussions, there's tensions. But also, within anarchistic thought, there's often the kind of, no nation, kind of discussion and a real anti-nationalism that can at times, I think, it makes things like anti-imperialists politics or international solidarity complicated, I'll say. Like it's not that people haven't figured out or don't think about ways to wave those together. And one of the things, we have another episode that probably will come out before this one, with Tariq Khan on his book, The Republic Shall Be Kept Clean. And I should say, like, he's very adamant, especially in the 19th century and early 20th century, that like most of the anarchists were immigrants anyway, and they didn't see something like a national independence movement as antagonistic to anarchist principles, and they had a strong anti-imperialist understanding. So they didn't see the nationalism of the United States, for instance, or of the UK as the same thing as a colonized country, gaining national independence. But I just found that interesting, and I found it interesting for Martin too. Obviously, he also has he's got a Black Puerto Rican kind of background. And so there's the importance of both of these movements and the influence of them, as you talked about, even early in his life. So just talk a little bit about his relationship to nationalism and whether you see kind of a consistent thread here or you see it as something kind of evolving for him over time.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll say it was not I don't think there's a point where it was, like, resolved for him, and that, makes sense in so many ways, but there's so many reasons why different forms of nationalism would be important to him, like the early life that I talked about of being, going as a kid to Michaud's bookstore and being around that Black nationalism, and then, yeah, Puerto Rican nationalism, which I really think for him was what he took from it was really about anti-colonialism and armed struggle. Like, that's
Yeah.
the when he writes the letter to Lolita LeBron, like, he's always talking about the importance of armed struggle and anti-colonialism. And, I thought a lot about, like, how central the struggle of Vietnamese people for national liberation was to his politics during this whole period, but it wasn't, like, the way that the anti-war movement positioned it, right, which was maybe about US imperialism, but he was firmly identified with the national liberation movement of people in Vietnam, and that's how he was always seeing himself, was through that lens of anti-colonial struggle. So, I think it was one of the sort of things that you can see him working through when he starts identifying as an anarchist. Like, I think there's this reference in a letter where he says, like, it contradicts the Black socialist nation that we're trying to build, because he's moving from kind of revolutionary Black nationalism at that point. But I think it's worth kind of thinking about, like, the things that drew him to all of these ideologies. So, like, the thing that drew him to the Puerto Rican independence movement, is like the anti-colonialism armed struggle. The thing that was drawing him to anarchism was its emphasis on action, prefiguration. So it's not that he wasn't anti-state, but I just don't think that was the thing that consumed him, was like the nation question per se. And I just think he was much more interested in, like, building, what he was calling, like, liberated territories or counter structures or whatever it is, and kind of moving outward from then. And I do think too, like, the nationalism that I see running through all of his life was just the emphasis on controlling land. So I even see the community centers and the affordable housing and the daycare center that he's building in New Jersey as part of that line, you know?
Yeah, and you have this great photo of him in like 1988, hanging out a window with the FSLN, the Sandinista National Liberation Front flag, which I think speaks to what you're talking about too. I mean, here he is, like, he's towards the end of his life. He's certainly probably as fully politically evolved. I mean, maybe he changes a little bit in the last 20 years or whatever. But, and yet there he's supporting this anti-colonial project in Nicaragua, like many leftists, like many anarchists too in that period. But, again, it's just interesting in terms of those, again, like, I guess thinking about the importance of struggle and national liberation and armed struggle, anti-colonial movements for him. And that doesn't go away for him at any point.
Yeah. And it's not symbolic. Like, they're sending refrigerators to the Sandinistas, It's, yeah.
Yeah, awesome. So you don't spend a whole lot of time on this, but it comes up a few different times. So I found this really interesting. There's the kind of psychiatric pathologization of Sostre that gets used by the state. It comes up in relation to at least one of his trials when he seeks to represent himself. It comes up in relation to the RX program, which we discussed previously. We did an episode on that with Orasami Burton a year or two ago. I don't know what time is anymore. And this also comes up, kind of on a related note of this refusal of him to submit to the so-called rectal exams, which, causes him all kinds of trouble. It's not an easy stance to take for him at all. But it kind of underpins a really important point in the book that comes up with him, which is his position, he's big into his bodily autonomy and the importance also of, individual acts, which this stood out to me too, of like, somebody has to do something that's going to cause the repression or is going to be an act of resistance. And it can even be one person doing it, but that can actually drive movements forward, which I think is, it challenges certain things because I think a lot of times we think about movements related to collective action or broad scale action. But in the context of the prison, sometimes he's trying to get collective action to going, but he's the only one who's willing to do certain things. And that's not going to stop him because it still has to happen. And so those are kind of somewhat disparate points. I don't know, maybe we should even parse them into a couple of different answers, but those two elements of like the kind of, well, that's like three things. There's the psychiatric pathologization sort of thing. There's the sort of bodily autonomy importance for him. And then this kind of individual acts of resistance point. I realize that's a very...
And it's my job to synthesize them.
Yeah, we can deal with them separately. Yeah, because it's not all related.
No. I mean, I think they are all related at some level, so I'll take a shot at it. I mean, I think I tried to track the escalation of the state's pathologizing and psychiatric torture, and I think Sostre is like a good example of how you can see that shift, right? Of like the ways that they're, pathologizing him and his resistance in Buffalo when he tries to represent himself, and even the sort of Nation of Islam more broadly in the late 50s, early 60s, and how by the RX program, they're like really experimenting with, full-blown torture, as Ori chronicles. And this was another like moment too, where I was checking in with Ori and I was like, oh, you're like way deeper in the RX research than I am. Because it was kind of a black hole. And I was trying to figure out like how far to go with it. And then I was really relieved that Ori was doing such a deep dive and amazing job with it, that I was like, great, I don't have to like spend another year doing this. So thank you, Ori. But yeah, so there's kind of the state's escalation of like all forms of repression and trying to, I think Ori talks about it in his book of like trying to control minds when they can't control people through the tools, the kind of blunt tools that they've had before of like solitary shifting people from prison to prison, like they do with Martin. They try to isolate him at wall kill. And yeah, I mean, I think it makes sense that Martin's affinity for anarchism aligns at this moment of asserting bodily autonomy, or vice versa, or whatever, the relationship of those things, because he really starts shifting to being like, no, liberation is about individual autonomy and freedom. And if like the movements that we're creating don't lead us to have individual freedom, then that's not a liberatory movement. And then also like seeing his resistance to the sexual assaults by the state as kind of a propaganda of the deed. Like he's trying to organize a full-scale boycott in the prison of it and get other people to resist it, and he gets a few, but it's really a kind of propagandistic point that he's making. But what I take that you kind of mentioned is like how these individual acts of resistance can lead to new terrains of struggle that escalate. Like I think you could make the argument that resistance to the assaults is what gets him free in 76. Like he's sort of just retrying through the legal system his case, and it's like there's nothing new. Like it's already been, Arda Williams literally says I framed him and he can't get a new trial. So it's actually through creating a new struggle that's not about his original frame up. It's about the ongoing assaults of the state that then rallied these committees. And I think that's just like such an important thing that I've taken in my organizing. It's like you can only get so far on a injustice, no matter how deep the injustice is, that happened X number of years ago, and you're getting further and further from that point, and you're trying to convince people like this thing happened and it was wrong. And then there's this new action, right? Where you're like, no, actually the state is doing this thing right now and this needs to happen. And there's this energy that's created through that. And then that energy sort of like propels. And that's why I talk about the Plattsburgh so much, is because then he's got this act of resistance that brings it home to people, and they're compelled to act and decide whether they would do the same thing as him. And that to me is like a really important way of how his individual active resistance radiates outward and becomes collective rather than sort of the reverse of that, which is I think what you were mentioning is where like we imagine that there'll be collective action that leads to individual people feeling freer. And he's sort of turning that inside out and saying like, no, we each have to like, we're each compelled to act with our own moral conscience on things that might seem routine. I mean, they were routine, right? And daily, and that those things can actually lead to collective action.
Yeah, it's great too. And I mean, I think it also, there's an important, I think, lesson or challenge for people to think about, right? Which is that we're all not willing to do the same things. So, there might be times where collectively we're like, okay, we're all going to do this action and we're all going to do this form of civil disobedience or whatever. But there are also going to be a lot of times, I think, where one or two people are willing to do something that other people are like, no, that's too risky. Like, I'm not going to do that. But I think it's then in, how do we then support in different ways that we're all willing to do the person who does the thing that we might not be willing to do, which I think is an important lesson. And I think it's one of the challenges that we face today, where we do have a lot of people in the last several years who have faced state repression due to individual acts of protest or, whatever. There often are not, a lot of people showing up or figuring out how are we going to do defense work for this person. And I think some of that might have to do, one of the questions I have, I guess, with this book is like, maybe that partly has to do with how we're thinking about defense work, that our own viewpoint of defense work might make it feel to us like that's too limited of a thing. It's not necessarily a dynamic enough political project that, I'm going to invest all of my time that I organize into that thing. I want to organize in some other way that I imagine to be more dynamic. And I think what this book poses as a challenge is like defense work could be as dynamic as, you can imagine it to be, or maybe more dynamic than you can imagine it to be. So yeah, I think it's a really cool kind of, I think, challenge posed by the history of his cases and looking at the ways that they evolved, as well as just him as an individual, his own willingness to always do something to kind of create a new area or whatever, that he could then take that struggle and bring other folks into it. It's pretty amazing. So related a little bit to that question, especially the bodily autonomy point, there's an influence of feminism that comes up that, seems quite important for him. So talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, this was one of those things where I just was like dying for more content. So it's a little bit gestural, but the information that we do have is that he, is really influenced by the women's liberation movement. He sees it, especially as the anti-Vietnam struggle is kind of dissipating. I think he sees radical feminism and women's liberation as like one of the more dynamic struggles happening. And, I think he's getting sent texts by, my guess is Sharon Fisher, his longtime defense committee head in Buffalo, and just being challenged around this politics. I mean, Martin was like open to lots of different things, I mean, he was just always rethinking everything. And so, yeah, women's liberation, I think, had a strong impact on him during this period. And what I sort of speculate in the book is that also is an influence on his emphasis on bodily autonomy, is reading, like he mentions, Firestone, and I think is probably reading Dialectic of Sex. And so I just think it's important to emphasize the role that radical feminism has on him turning towards an emphasis on bodily autonomy and anarchism. And he talks a little bit about how some of these defense committees also kind of like establish like subcommittees on women's liberation or focus on that within the committees that he's really interested in.
Yeah, it's very cool. So yeah, so we've mentioned this a couple times, but one of the more interesting organizing episodes in the book is the organizing around the Plattsburgh trial. It takes place in a prison town, or at least the same county as a prison, and is, it's kind of this against all odds moment, because like the jury is not going to be a jury of his peers. It's going to be a white jury, right? And it's going to be a jury that probably has folks that family members or whatever work in prisons or friends or whatever. And it doesn't lead to a legal outcome. Like Sostre doesn't win this trial from a legal perspective, but it does demonstrate the power of organizing against all these odds and producing new formations or organizations as well as possibilities down the road. So say a little bit about this.
Yeah, so I mean the trial itself is coming out of one of the assaults that it's one of the first assaults that he survives for his resistance of the rectal examinations. And then the state, as he's trying to sue the state for the assault, that they hold up his legal paperwork and instead they charge him with assault. So because of the persistent felony laws in New York, he actually is facing a life sentence for this on top of his 31 to 41 years that he's serving. And he essentially gets arraigned in Plattsburgh, and some local college students show up, and he just goes over to them as like, you have to start a defense committee. And they're just so moved by him and the image of him coming into the courtroom in chains and shackles. And so they start this local committee. And over the course of 2 years, it really develops into this robust thing. And then, Frame Up comes out during this time. And so they start showing the film, and that really catalyzes their ability to sort of like screen the film and start new committees. And because he's at the nearby prison, he's at Clinton in Dannemora, but then he's also being held for periods of time at the Watertown jail. He's just able to sort of like visit with people more, and there's all these kind of committees cropping up. And it reaches this pinnacle at the trial itself in 1975. I mentioned Liz Fink and Dennis Cunningham are his attorneys. There's, all this kind of Daniel Berrigan's coming up and holding rallies. And then what eventually happens is, as you mentioned, there's this all-white jury that's drawn from the town, and he gets convicted. And they stand up and protest, and 12 of his supporters get arrested and kind of become known as the Plattsburgh 12. And it's just such a constellation of like all of Martin's ideas about struggle, of how he takes sort of the hidden everyday violence of the prison, and his resistance to it becomes this, political trial in Plattsburgh, and people are drawn into seeing the fascism of the court. So there's people who are not arrested that day, but are radicalized by that moment, and they start the Potsdam Committee. And I talk a lot about what the Potsdam Committee becomes and the type of work that they do as well. So it's just this like history that I didn't know existed before writing this book. And I think it just like is a distillation of so many of his ideas about how revolutionary struggle can happen in one episode.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the interesting episodes, and I remember you had tweeted about this at one point, is this kind of interaction between Martin and James and Grace Lee Boggs, which I think takes place through a letter to Daniel Berrigan. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's even more complicated, but
okay. Yeah, well, you can explain that. Yeah, but so talk a little bit about this episode and what you were kind of trying to grapple with in regards to this in the text.
Yeah, I mean, it's essentially, Daniel Berrigan has started with some other folks in New York City, a Manhattan Defense Committee, which is like more politically connected than a lot of these other committees that are started by like college students and things like that. And so Berrigan, is a former political prisoner and well-known, and he reaches out to these philanthropists and asks for funds for the Sostre Committee. And those philanthropists are connected to Jimmy and Grace, and he asked them about Martin, and they write back this really hostile response. And they had been supporters of Martin after the initial frame up in Buffalo, but they were really critical. And it's unclear, I'm saying they here, but it's unclear whether it's actually written. It sounds a little bit more like Grace, but the critique was essentially that Martin's like making a martyr of himself, and he's trying to make this movement all about him. And I just remember reading this and being like, what the fuck are they talking about? Like, I was really devastated by it because just the Boggses have been a political influence to me and a lot of my mentors. It's just like a strain of politics that goes back quite a ways for me. And it just, to me, was like missing the mark in so many ways. And really, it was helpful. I sort of went through, I wound up co-writing this article with Stevie Wilson and Stephen Ward, who wrote this great, biography of the Boggses and is a mentor of mine. But through the conversations with Stephen, I came to understand like really how this is rooted in their misunderstanding of Attica, and that they saw Attica as essentially like a prison reform movement. And so the thing I was kind of trying to grapple with was just that people didn't necessarily like Martin resisting state-sanctioned sexual assault and saying this is a part of worldwide revolutionary struggle was not like an easy point for people to understand, even if they were like seasoned revolutionary organizers. And you get this in some of the like letters and calls to his committees too, where like the people on his committees were supporting him on the basis of the original frame up, not necessarily the actions he was doing now or at the time. And I just thought it was a really good example of how people can get kind of caught in like single issue organizing mindset. You're like, oh, this is a protest by people in prison, so it must be about prison conditions, and that's the narrow way that it should be understood. I mean, it wasn't even like Jimmy and Grace weren't in contact with people inside. Like they had conversations with Martin. So part of me initially wanted to be like, oh, maybe they're just not connected to folks. But I think it went deeper than that. I think it was just like an example of how people did not see incarcerated folks as part of revolutionary organizing. Like that they could only organize on the basis of that particular condition and not something broader than that, which was so antithetical to how Martin was operating.
Yeah, it's I mean, it's such a fascinating thing, and I mean, there are some interesting issues, I think. One being, like, thinking about this time and, figures like George Jackson and how there was a certain, I don't wanna say, well, maybe trend, but there was a way in which, at this time period, there's a lot of people who are interested in taking direction or being led by an incarcerated person. Like this had a kind of a political cachet of sorts. Like, and you can kind of see it with something like maybe the Symbionese Liberation Army, where Cinque de Vries is like sort of positioned as a nominal leader, but then you go back and you talk to folks or you listen to folks who were part of SLA talk about it, and they were like, he wasn't really the leader, but there was like I don't know. I mean, I'd probably have to dig deeper into this to pull out some good examples, but the prison movement in certain ways was seen as like the cutting edge by certain folks of all revolutionary struggle. So you had that position by certain folks. And you had certain people who were like, I think because George Jackson is such a brilliant theorist and then he's martyred and then you have Attica, like he takes on this almost like sort of, well, it's a martyr, like it's a god-like kind of prominence, I guess, within certain sectors of the movement. And there's kind of, I think, maybe a look by certain groups or organizations or people just to kind of look for the next George Jackson in certain ways. And so there's something within aspects of their critique, and it's something even I've talked to about with folks who organize with prisoners too, right? Of like, there's certain level of like, we don't want to necessarily put these people up on pedestals and not have critical discussion, or that we have to accept every line that they take, which is also an interesting problem with Martin to some extent because he is so individually driven. And if he has a position, like he's going to take it. And some people might be like, I don't agree with him on this. And, maybe that's the Workers' World Party story to some extent, right? So there's seeds in there that are interesting, but I agree with you very much in terms of the way it lands, and just kind of the inverse of getting too serious about being critical around some of those issues is to sort of say, well, I'm not going to worry about what he's dealing with right now, or that's not actually revolutionary or whatever. And meanwhile, you have this person who's really involved in this struggle, which is quite important and has a lot of political energy around it. And yeah, you can get to those questions of like, when people say something's not revolutionary, it's like, well, what exactly is? What makes organizing around some other issue more revolutionary than this? Because I think a lot of what makes something revolutionary is about what's going on with the people who are organizing around it and the kind of political content that they're all like pouring into it together. So anyways, I don't know. I just found it an interesting exchange. And it's one of those things where I wish there was also more where you could kind of like hear longer form perspectives on some of these things. But I think that does make some sense. I mean, the other part about it to give them some credit too is I think like their ideas around kind of dialectical humanism or revolutionary humanism also were very influential on some of the, like I think about somebody like James Yaki Sales, and when I read his writing and his thinking about Fanon, like I see the kind of Fanonian humanism, but I also am like, he's in the Midwest, and I think there's some Boggses in here too. And so, yeah, this is an interesting little episode, I guess.
I guess I guess the part that I felt almost the most dismayed about with it was not even like, disappointment in the critique or something. It was that I actually think that Martin embodies so much of their ideas about dialectical humanism of like, if you think about his life transformation, of how he's politicized, it's like that their critique is just applied to such the wrong person. I'm like, I just feel like it's actually a missed opportunity for them to see someone who's really putting into practice their ideas about revolutionary struggle, not like as their own, but that they could see those ideas. And instead they are like really hung up on like what they're calling the political prisoner syndrome or whatever.
Yeah.
And it's just like, yeah, I think to your point, it's like the way that sometimes a critique becomes a line.
Yeah.
And a line becomes something that's actually hindering your ability to see like a dynamic new thing when it's happening.
Yeah, no, that's a good way of putting it. Good point. So eventually he gets out of prison. So let's just start there. Like, how does that happen?
I mean, things just kind of escalate after Plattsburgh in 75. He had been named a Amnesty International prisoner of conscience. He was the only Amnesty International appointed person in the U.S. because they believe that was the only political prisoner in the U.S. at the time.
Yeah, Amnesty does not have a great track record on supporting U.S.
No.
political prisoners.
No. But they showed up, they were convinced by Martin, and they were doing work for him. And so a lot of those like kind of big names that you see signing on are really like a result of that turn, and then like the Berrigan connection and the Manhattan Committee. And they're just, the last year was like an all-out campaign shift towards clemency, where they were just sending letters to the governor and showing up. Like they were following Governor Hugh Carey around. Like Berrigan and some folks were just sitting in his office. They were just following him from event to event, doing demos. So eventually, it was a Christmas clemency in late 75, and his sentence was commuted, and he came home in February of 76.
Awesome. So there's an interesting thing. There's a few different aspects of his life. You write quite a bit about his life after he gets out of prison, which I really appreciated. But one of them is he spends a little time with PLS, which is, I think, is it Prison Litigation Services or what is it?
It's Prisoner Legal Services.
Prisoner Legal Services. It's an organization that's still around. I actually know at least one former political prisoner who currently works with them. And, they do a lot of really important, good legal work. And so Martin kind of starts there or ends up there, but doesn't last very long there and moves away. And I found it like a really interesting episode because, here's this guy who's, as I said earlier, like he's probably the greatest jailhouse lawyer in the United States, history. He gets out, he tries to do a little bit of legal work, and it just isn't for him, or they can't really figure out how to utilize his skills in a way that makes sense for him. And he just sort of says, you know what, I'm going to be a tenant organizer. Like I'm on the outside now. And obviously, we'll leave. I want to talk a little bit about Passaic and Patterson, so we'll leave that for another quick follow-up for this. But just help us understand how you understand that decision by him to not stay at PLS and like use his brilliant legal mind for that kind of work.
Yeah, this period was so difficult to write about because I just couldn't really figure out exactly what he was doing. It was so sporadic, but it really makes sense, like, in a way, that he comes home and he's had so much success with a particular type of organizing. And then it's like the available options are almost kind of like non-profitized versions of the organizing he was doing, which is very different. And I think it's one very important that when he came home and people were like, "Oh, are you going to become a lawyer?" He's like, "No, I'm an organizer." And I just think like that's such a clear, like, yeah, he was an organizer who used the law. He was not interested in like doing legal work. And I think his wife Liz said something like she was talking about doing some sort of work inside, and he was like, "No, we got to organize this community. Like we have to do tenant," because he was like seeing what was happening in New York with the fiscal crisis, and just was like, these homes are going to get totally, I mean, exactly what happened. So yeah, he was always just sort of, I think, understanding him first and foremost as an organizer, and as such, he's going to organize around whatever is happening in his community. And so that was in prison for most of his adult life, and then when he came home, it wasn't. But I also think there is an interesting lesson in the PLS phase. Like I found a few people who briefly worked with him there, and these were like, Ivy trained law folks who were like fresh out of law school and then plopped in a position, usually supervising Martin. And they were just like, he actually had no real role to play because he wasn't barred. He couldn't go visit the prison. And so all the brilliant legal work that he was able to do from like solitary confinement, he actually couldn't do from like a decently funded outside organization. And his analysis of the law, like I just, in one of the interviews, like they just said like his analysis of the law was so far ahead of all of ours. Like we were all coming from like a, legal background that was like, here's how we can use the law to change conditions or whatever. And he just had an analysis that was way ahead of theirs. And they sort of like understood that looking back at it. So there was just really no room for him there. And then, yeah, and that it made so much sense in a way with like what he wound up doing in New Jersey.
So yeah, let's talk about New Jersey a little bit to close out. So he ends up kind of just getting into this like institution building kind of phase, these suburban, I mean, they're large, but, outside of New York City in these, I guess they call them bedroom communities. I don't know, commuter communities, basically from in northern New Jersey. So talk a little bit about the work that he did there, in the last few years of his life.
Yeah, I mean, like so much of organizing, it kind of just like you find the right place or person and it clicks. So Sandy Shivak was, half Martin's age. He was doing work with youth in his hometown of Passaic and just got connected with Martin. And he would kind of like occasionally invite Martin down to hang out with the kids there. And Martin connected with them so well. And, Sandy tells the story of like after one of these meetings, they're driving back. He's going to drive Martin back to New York. And Martin's like asking him to pull over on the side of the road and look at this abandoned building. And Sandy's just like, what the hell are we doing? And Martin's asking questions like, who owns this building? And, just has like this very sophisticated at that point understanding of like what this type of work could look like. And kind of, they just were a good pair. Like Sandy could write grants and had connections to the local community there and was working with kids, which were like three things that then Martin could plug into with, a interest and background in construction, a political analysis of like what controlling space meant for a community. So over the course of 15, 20 years, they essentially like worked with young teenagers in mostly Passaic and then finally in Patterson to rebuild a half dozen buildings, one of them into this community center that becomes the base of Jeep, and then others into like Section 8 affordable housing, and the last one into a daycare center that they wind up running together. And those buildings all still exist and serve as community spaces. And yeah, it's just, I don't know. I found it a fascinating turn that made more and more sense the more I kind of thought about it.
Yeah. Awesome. I want to do two things before I let you go, if that's okay. One is just, I want to go back to something you write about. I think it might be in the introduction, but this idea of an original Black political ideology, which I think is something that Martin actually says. Let's just talk about some of the elements. You know, there's his internationalism, which is always, there throughout his life. Propaganda of the deed being an important thing for him. This belief in prefiguration or prefigurative politics, the liberation of the individual, personal freedoms and things like this, and connected with collective liberation. And, being a dialectical thinker with still like quite steadfast principles. And kind of all spaces as possible sites of resistance. These are kind of, I think I'm summarizing what you said, but those were some of the things that I pulled out. So yeah, just say a little bit about maybe this, as we wrap it up. Like, how do you kind of think about Martin Sostre as what the components of his political ideology, I guess?
Yeah, I think part of it was like he obviously lived this interesting, fascinating life. And both according to his wife and according to my own political desires, like I didn't want this to just be a history of like, here's this interesting life that, I wanted to tease out like, what are the political lessons of all of these things? And to me, like both in my own work as a historian, I think it's always valuable. Like I get frustrated with texts that kind of have ideas that aren't rooted in material conditions. Like how does the idea apply? And we can see in the material conditions how it plays out. And so I'm interested in that idea in general, but then like in Martin's case, it's just such a story where like you have to see it that way because his ideas are always emerging out of material conditions that he's grappling with in such a clear way. So I think you summarized like all the main points. I mean, I think they're also like when you say them, they sound so simple, you know? Like he was an original political thinker because he believed that action was more important than words. Like that sounds so empty on some level, but I think having the content of his life alongside that, you get to see how deep that commitment is, like what it actually means to live that. Or yeah, to say prefiguration and counter structures, but then to realize like what the scope of those could look like. It can mean bookstores. It can mean, when your bookstore gets raided, that then you turn it into a bookstore in exile that's actually just like these tables in a student union. And the idea of like creatively using repression to escalate the struggle and form these new methods of dissent. I just think like to me the lessons are sort of these like diffuse examples of how we can creatively form resistance in all sorts of spaces and everyday ways. And it's not like you're not just waiting for some conditions to emerge or, a person or an organization. Like he's just initiating so many things. And yet it's not a solitary struggle at all. Like I hope in the book you see like how many people are involved in all of this work and that they're all sort of like interconnected and becoming animated through Martin's energy. Like he just has this energy that brings people into struggle and empowers them to do things. So I don't know. I mean, there's all these like components, none of which on their own are, like saying propaganda of the deed or prefiguration or any of these things stand alone as like original ideas. But I think the composite of them and the way that he puts them into action is very unique. I constantly find like in my organizing that I'm using these lessons without even kind of realizing that I'm using them.
Awesome. Well, that's the last thing. I wanted to give you space just as we close out. If there's anything that you want to, plug or mention. Obviously, the book, people should buy the book and read it. It's really, I think, a very interesting read. And I appreciate the point you just made too. I mean, there was a part of me that wanted to ask you about the move, because you moved it from UNC Press to AK Press. I don't know all the meaning. You talk about it a little bit in, I think, the acknowledgments, but it's just interesting to think like, okay, there's one thing to publish an academic, history biography of a figure, and then another thing of saying, okay, I actually want to talk about the politics quite a bit of this too. But yeah, anything that you kind of want to say as you close us out, Garrett?
I mean, we already mentioned it before, but the exoneration campaign for sure for Geraldine and Martin. There's just incredible local organizing happening in Buffalo around not just that, but really memorializing and actualizing a lot of the key elements of their legacy of Geraldine and Martin in Buffalo, which is fantastic. I mentioned the influence of Martin's ideas on my own work. So like the Free the Mississippi 5 campaign that I'm working on with folks, it's like, it's not a coincidence that I fell into political defense work while writing this book, and then thinking about that political defense work as collective and dynamic. Like when you were mentioning it earlier, I was just like, oh, that makes sense that I think about political defense work in that way. And then, yeah, if folks, especially if you want to check out the book, and we have a specific Incarcerated Readers edition paperback that's going to be published at the same time as the hardback. So I appreciate people doing that.
Awesome. Well, we'll make sure to link all of those things in the show description so that people can connect to those different campaigns. Garrett, thank you so much. Thanks for writing the book and taking this time to talk with us about it.
Thanks for having me on, Jay.